He waved my non-compete in my face and called it my leash. He never read the clause that muzzled his company, not me. Tuesday, 4:22 p.m. Dylan Marsh is leaned back in his glass-walled corner office. The conference room he'd had converted 3 weeks ago. New carpet still off-gassing that chemical sweetness. And he's sliding a document across the table toward me with one manicured finger like he's dealing a card. This is your leash for the next 2 years. He says it without looking at me. AirPods still in. Slim-fit navy suit without a single wrinkle. Tag Heuer on his wrist catching the overhead lights. A wedding gift from his father-in-law, the CEO. The man is 29 years old. He's been in aerospace for 13 months. 13 months of what his LinkedIn calls Aerospace Innovation Consulting, which, as far as I can tell, means living in Robert Ainsworth's guest house in Eastboro and attending dinner parties. Behind him, an HR rep I've never met stands near the door, clutching a tablet to her chest, like a shield. She won't make eye contact with me. Dylan taps the non-compete again. Crestline is sunsetting legacy architecture. We're moving to a scalable, agile development model. A digital transformation roadmap. I know that's a lot of new vocabulary for you, but the bottom line is simple. He pauses, like he's rehearsed this part. We're restructuring, and your role has been eliminated. 15 years, 340 aircraft, 12 airlines, $5.2 billion in annual maintenance and licensing revenue flowing through code my hands wrote. Eliminated. He pushes the termination paperwork forward. A neat stack. Flags where I'm supposed to sign. I don't argue. I don't flinch. I look at the papers for a moment, then at him. He's already glancing at his phone. Noted. I sign the termination, set the pen down, stand up, walk toward the door. Then I stop, turn back. You might want to read the rest of that file, not just the non-compete. Dylan waves me off without looking up, already typing something on his phone, probably a LinkedIn post. The HR rep opens the door for me. Her hand is shaking. My name is Garrett Hale. I'm 49 years old. I spent 15 years at Crestline Aerospace as Chief Flight Software Architect, which is a fancy title for the man who wrote every line of code that keeps their planes in the air. Before Crestline, I spent 11 years in the United States Navy as an aviation electronics technician, Petty Officer First Class. Served aboard the USS Carl Vinson, CVN-70, 2 Western Pacific deployments. I maintained and troubleshot avionics systems on F/A-18 Hornets, while the flight deck pitched under my feet, and the Pacific tried to throw me off it. You learn precision in that environment. Not because someone grades you on it, because imprecision kills people. After the Navy, I spent 5 years as an independent avionics contractor. Basement of my house in Wichita. A workbench, an oscilloscope I'd had since my last deployment, and a server rack I built from surplus parts I bought at government auction for $1,100. The hum of cooling fans at 2 in the morning, the smell of solder flux and clean electricity. That's where the code was born. My proprietary flight control methodology, the autopilot logic, the fly-by-wire architecture, every failsafe and decision tree. All of it written on my own hardware, on my own time, before Crestline Aerospace had a name anyone outside of Wichita had ever heard. Robert Ainsworth recruited me when the company was operating out of a leased hangar on the south side of town near McConnell Air Force Base. 6 employees, no office furniture. Robert's desk was a door laid across 2 filing cabinets. I was employee number 7. I brought the code with me like a carpenter brings his own tools. That code became the nervous system of every aircraft Crestline ever produced. 340 planes in active service, 12 airlines, $5.2 billion in annual maintenance and licensing revenue. Every dollar of it flowing through software architecture I designed in a basement on a surplus server rack before the company could afford to buy me a chair. And it cost me. Last spring, Claire, my daughter, 16, a competitive swimmer, qualified for regionals in the 200-meter butterfly. First time she'd made state. She'd been getting up at 5 a.m. for practices all season. Chlorine smells so deep in the car seats, it never washed out. The kind of discipline I recognized because it looked like mine. Her regional qualifier was on a Saturday. I told her I'd be there. I wasn't there. A certification review for the FAA ran until midnight the night before, and by the time I got home, she was asleep. Ellen, my wife, 47, a QA engineer at a defense subcontractor down the road, had recorded the race on her phone. Claire touched the wall a half second under her target time. I watched the video in the kitchen at 1 in the morning, volume low so I wouldn't wake anyone. Ellen had left a plate of food in the microwave. I didn't eat it. That was the deal I'd made. Not with Crestline, with myself. That the work mattered enough to miss things that couldn't be unmissed. Ellen ate dinner alone 3 nights a week for years. I worked through 2 Thanksgivings. I sold my fishing boat during a cash crunch in year 4 when the company missed a quarter. Sold it for $6,000 to cover a gap that wasn't mine to cover. Robert Ainsworth bought a new Cadillac Escalade that same month. I didn't say anything. I just kept writing code. Ellen told me 10 years ago to stop being a doormat. I told her it wasn't like that. She looked at me the way she looks at a failed test result. Patient, precise, and completely unconvinced. She was right, of course. Ellen is usually right. That's the thing about marrying a woman who reads compliance documentation for a living. She sees the fine print. Which brings me to section 19A, 15 years ago. Our kitchen table. The same table where I'd eaten cereal that morning and would eat dinner that night. Neil Fletcher sat across from me with a red pen and a legal pad. Neil and I served together on the Carl Vinson. He was an operations specialist, E5, quiet kid from Lawrence who read law textbooks in his rack while the rest of us played cards. Left the Navy after 8 years. Used the GI Bill. Went to the University of Kansas for law school. Now, he's a patent and IP attorney specializing in aerospace and defense, with offices here in Wichita. We've been close for 20 years. He's the kind of friend who picks up on the second ring. That night, we were reviewing Crestline's offer. Ellen stood at the kitchen counter, arms crossed, listening. I had 2 concerns. One, I was bringing code I'd already written on my own equipment, on my own time. That code was mine. I needed it to stay mine. 2, Crestline couldn't afford to pay me what I was worth. Not yet. The company was running on fumes and Robert Ainsworth's stubbornness. Neil's solution was Section 19A. The language was surgical. Crestline would receive a perpetual, non-exclusive license to operate, update, maintain, and distribute all flight control software developed under my proprietary methodology. In return, I'd get a salary, benefits, and the chance to build something real. But the license had a kill switch. Upon involuntary termination without cause, the license would auto-terminate. The code stays. The right to use it doesn't. Robert Ainsworth signed it without blinking. He needed me more than I needed him. That was the last time the balance was in my favor. Until now. Ellen was the one who insisted we get it in writing. I remember her exact words from that kitchen table, arms still crossed, looking at Neil. If this company ever gets big enough to forget who built it, that clause is the only thing that'll remember. Neil filed the final version with the county clerk and kept a certified copy in his office safe. He's updated the supporting IP documentation every year since. 15 years. Like a fire extinguisher behind glass. You hope you never need it. You check the pressure gauge anyway. The evening after the firing, I went down to the basement lab. Same workbench. Same oscilloscope. Same surplus server rack humming in the corner, the single overhead bulb with its pull chain throwing hard shadows across the concrete floor. The smell of solder flux hung in the air the way it always does. Faint, metallic, permanent. This room is where the code was born. When the world gets loud, I go underground. I sat at the bench for a while. Then I pulled out my phone and called Neil Fletcher. He answered on the second ring. Same as always. I told him what happened. Dylan Marsh. The non-compete. The word leash. Neil was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then he said, Garrett, they didn't just fire you. They handed you the keys to the entire fleet. I asked about the non-compete. The 2-year restriction Dylan had waved like a flag. Neil almost laughed. Almost. The non-compete restricts your employment. It says you can't go work for a competitor. Fine. It doesn't restrict your property. You're not going to work for anyone, Garrett. You're licensing your own IP. Dylan Marsh waved a piece of paper that has nothing to do with what's about to happen. I looked at the leather-bound notebook sitting on the shelf above my bench. The original architecture notes. Every algorithm, every failsafe, every decision tree, written in the same precise block letters I used for maintenance logs aboard the Carl Vinson. The spine is cracked. The pages smell like this room. Filing goes out first thing in the morning, Neil said. Certified mail and courier. Copies to Crestline's registered agent, their general counsel, and the FAA's Aircraft Certification Service. 6 pages, single-spaced. I've had it drafted for 15 years. I didn't say anything for a moment. Just listened to the hum of the server rack. Steady. Indifferent. The same sound it's been making since I bolted it to the floor 20 years ago. Do it, I said. I hung up. Set the phone face down on the workbench. Sat in the quiet of the basement. The overhead bulb swaying, just slightly from the furnace, kicking on upstairs. Upstairs, I could hear Ellen moving in the kitchen. The soft clatter of a plate being set in the sink. She knew where I was. She knew not to come down. Not yet. I opened the notebook, ran my thumb along the cracked spine. Page 1. Revision date. 20 years ago. My handwriting hadn't changed. Neither had the clause. If you've ever had a boss who couldn't do your job for 5 minutes, hit that like button and subscribe. Wednesday morning, 7:14 a.m. While Neil Fletcher was printing the Section 19A notice at his office on Douglas Avenue, Dylan Marsh was composing a company-wide email from the corner office he'd occupied for less than a month. I didn't see the email myself. Margaret Ward read it to me over the phone that afternoon, her voice flat, the way it gets when she's trying not to say something she'll regret. The subject line was, "A bold new chapter for Crestline Aerospace." Team, exciting news. As part of our digital transformation roadmap, we're restructuring the technology division to align with a scalable, agile development model. Change is never easy, but it's always necessary. I'm confident that by sunsetting legacy infrastructure and embracing fresh perspectives, we'll position Crestline for its strongest decade yet. More details to come. Hashtag Crestline Forward. He signed it Dylan Marsh, VP of Technology Strategy. A title that had existed for 4 months. A title Robert Ainsworth invented over Thanksgiving dinner, so his son-in-law would have something to put on a business card. By 8:30, Dylan had posted on LinkedIn. Margaret sent me the screenshot. Profile photo taken in the corner office, my old conference room, with the Wichita skyline behind him through the glass. The caption read, "Day 1 of bold leadership means having the courage to sunset legacy systems and invest in the future. Proud to lead Crestline's technology transformation. The best is ahead. Hashtag innovation. Hashtag aerospace. Leadership. Hashtag next gen." 47 likes by noon. Mostly from people who didn't work in aerospace. That same morning, according to Margaret, Dylan held a call with an offshore development firm in Bangalore. He told Robert Ainsworth it would take 6 months to replicate the autopilot code. Tops. At a third of the cost. He used the phrase technical debt reduction 4 times in a 15-minute conversation. Margaret was in the adjacent office. The walls in that part of the building are thin. Garrett Hale built flight control systems that could land a 737 in a crosswind. Dylan Marsh thought you could replace that with a purchase order. The email from Margaret hit my phone at 10:47 a.m. She didn't call. She texted a screenshot. 3 weeks old. An internal thread between Dylan and Robert that she'd been CC'd on by accident when Dylan forwarded it to HR without checking the chain. Dylan's words, "Hale is a relic. He's been building the same system for 15 years, like it's still 2010. I can outsource this to a team in Bangalore and cut $4 million a year in salary overhead. The man's holding us hostage with his own mediocrity." Robert Ainsworth's reply, sent 11 minutes later. "Handle it. Just make sure the non-compete is airtight." Mediocrity. I read it standing in my kitchen. The thermos was on the counter. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. Outside the window, the Kansas wind was bending the dead grass along the fence line, the way it always does in late October. Sideways, persistent, indifferent to what anyone thinks about it. I set the phone face down on the counter. Ellen was in the doorway. She'd come in from the garage, keys still in her hand, her badge lanyard from the defense subcontractor hanging around her neck. She'd seen my face before I could arrange it. "That bad?" she asked. "That clear," I said. She set her keys on the hook by the door. Didn't ask to see the phone. Didn't need to. 15 years married to a man who builds fail-safes for a living. She already knew what the architecture looked like when it was about to execute. At 9:15 that morning, an hour and a half before I read Dylan's email, an hour before Dylan's LinkedIn post hit 47 likes, Neil Fletcher walked into the Wichita office of a bonded courier service on East Central Avenue and handed over a 6-page document in a sealed legal envelope. The formal section 19A revocation notice. Certified mail and hand-delivered courier. Addressed to Crestline Aerospace LLC's registered agent, with copies to Victor Stafford, General Counsel, and the FAA's Aircraft Certification Service in Oklahoma City. The language was the language Neil and I had drafted at my kitchen table 15 years ago, updated annually, pressure tested against every amendment to Crestline's operating agreements. 6 pages, single-spaced. The core paragraph read, per Section 19A of the employment agreement between Garrett Hale and Crestline Aerospace LLC, dated 15 years prior, Mr. Hale's involuntary termination without cause triggers automatic and immediate revocation of the perpetual, non-exclusive license granted to Crestline Aerospace to operate, update, maintain, and distribute flight control software developed under his proprietary methodology. This revocation is effective upon receipt of this notice. All 340 aircraft currently operating under this software are doing so without a valid software license as of the date and time of this delivery. Neil called me at 9:48 a.m. Delivered. Signed for by the front desk at 9:41. Courier confirmation in my hand. FAA copy went out simultaneously. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Black coffee. Dented thermos lid. The same spot where we'd drafted Section 19A. I could see the backyard through the window. The empty space where the boat trailer used to sit before I sold it to cover Robert Ainsworth's missed quarter. Thanks, Neil. Garrett, he paused. Go do something with your day. Take your wife to lunch. This part runs itself. He was right about that. The document was a machine. All I had to do was turn the key. Gravity did the rest. Wednesday, 11:40 a.m. Victor Stafford's office. Second floor of Crestline's administrative building, south side of campus. The one with the framed FAA type certificates lining the hallway like headstones. Stafford opened the courier package himself. He told me this later. Months later, after everything had settled, over a cup of coffee, he probably wished was something stronger. He said he read the first page and felt the floor tilt. He walked to the corporate vault. A fireproof filing cabinet in the legal archive room, combination lock, 3 keys held by 3 different officers. He pulled Garrett Hale's original employment contract, 32 pages, yellowed at the edges. Robert Ainsworth's signature at the bottom in blue ink that had faded to almost gray. He turned to section 19A, read it once, twice, a third time slower, his index finger tracing each line like he was looking for the crack, the ambiguity, the escape hatch. There wasn't one. Neil Fletcher doesn't leave escape hatches. Stafford picked up his desk phone, dialed Robert Ainsworth's cell directly, not Dylan. He did not call Dylan. "Mr. Ainsworth, I need you in my office. Now." A pause. The kind of pause that carries weight through a phone line. "We have a problem that money might not fix." Robert Ainsworth was in Stafford's office within 12 minutes. Stafford laid it out. Every aircraft Kreslin had ever produced, every single one of the 340 planes in active service across 12 airlines worldwide, ran on Garrett Hale's flight control software. Kreslin didn't own that software. Never did. They held a license that was contingent on one condition, that Garrett Hale remained employed voluntarily or was terminated for documented cause. Dylan Marsh had terminated him without cause, without board approval, without legal review, without reading past page 4 of a 32-page employment contract. The license died at 9:41 a.m. when the front desk signed for the courier. Robert's first words, according to Stafford, "That's not possible." Stafford slid the contract across the desk. Open to section 19A. "Your signature, Mr. Ainsworth, page 31. Robert stared at it. His own handwriting. 15 years old. The signature of a man who'd needed Garrett Hale more than he could afford to lose him, and had agreed to terms that reflected that truth. "Who authorized this termination?" Robert asked. His voice was quiet. The dangerous kind of quiet. "Your son-in-law," Stafford said, "without board approval, without legal review, without reading past page 4 of a 32-page contract." By Friday, the FAA had received its copy of the Section 19A notice. The agency's aircraft certification service issued an emergency airworthiness directive affecting all 340 Kreslin aircraft pending resolution of the software licensing dispute. The directive was clear. Until Kreslin could demonstrate a valid license to operate the flight control software installed in its aircraft, those aircraft could not be certified as airworthy. Airlines started grounding planes Friday afternoon. 12 carriers. Schedules thrown into chaos. Operations centers lighting up across 3 continents. Phone lines at Kreslin's customer service division rang so constantly, the voicemail system crashed twice before 5 o'clock. Dylan Marsh's inbox filled with messages he didn't understand. Technical language, legal citations, regulatory references. Words like airworthiness and certification basis and remediation timeline. He forwarded 3 of them to an assistant and asked for a summary. The assistant quit the following Monday. Dylan's LinkedIn post was still live. Bold leadership. Sunset Legacy Systems. 47 likes. 340 planes on the ground. I was home. Ellen was at work. Claire was at swim practice, slicing through the water at the East Wichita YMCA at 5 a.m. like she did every morning, the discipline of it as steady and unforgiving as a clock. The house was quiet. I was in the basement, reorganizing my notebook, cleaning the soldering station, wiping down the tip, sorting components into labeled bins, the kind of work my hands do when my mind is already 3 moves ahead. The server rack hummed. The pull chain bulb threw its hard circle of light across the bench. My phone buzzed on the workbench. I glanced at it. 14 missed calls from Kreslin numbers. I didn't answer. Didn't listen to the voicemails. I already knew what they said. I texted Margaret instead. 1 line. "How's the weather over there?" Her reply came in 9 seconds. Biblical. Friday, 4:45 p.m. Robert Ainsworth called my cell phone. I was still in the basement. The oscilloscope was running a diagnostic I didn't need to run. just something to keep the screen alive, the green line tracing its steady sine wave like a heartbeat. The phone rang 6 times. I watched it vibrate against the workbench, Robert's name glowing on the screen. Voicemail. I set the phone face down, went back to the oscilloscope. The green line kept tracing. The server rack kept humming. Somewhere above me, I heard the front door open. Claire home from school, backpack hitting the floor, the refrigerator door opening and closing. Normal sounds. The sounds of a house where someone is home before dark for the first time in 15 years. Outside, across town, 340 aircraft sat on tarmacs in 12 countries, their flight control systems running software that no one at Crestline Aerospace had the legal right to touch, update, or certify. 12 airlines were mobilizing legal teams. The FAA was drafting enforcement timelines. Dylan Marsh was sitting in his glass-walled corner office, trying to understand a crisis built from language he'd never bothered to read, wearing a suit that cost more than the surplus server rack that had just grounded his father-in-law's entire fleet. And the man who wrote the code was in his basement in Wichita, cleaning a soldering iron, listening to his daughter open the refrigerator, waiting for nothing. The phone buzzed again. Another Crestline number. I let it ring. The server rack hummed. The emergency board meeting convened 9 days after the FAA directive. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. Margaret called me that evening and told me everything. Her voice carrying the careful precision of a woman who'd spent 12 years documenting flight test data and knew the difference between observation and interpretation. The boardroom was the original one, not Dylan's converted office, but the long room on the 3rd floor with the walnut table Robert Ainsworth had bought when Crestline landed its first airline contract. Framed photographs of every aircraft the company ever produced lined the walls. Tail numbers on brass plaques. 15 years of engineering reduced to decoration. 9 board members. Victor Stafford at one end with a stack of filings 2 inches thick. Robert Ainsworth at the other end, his face the color of old concrete. And Dylan Marsh, seated at the far corner, pale, silent. The Tag Heuer catching the overhead fluorescent light every time his hand moved to adjust his tie. He'd stopped wearing the AirPods. Small mercies. Stafford presented the legal exposure in the flat, measured tone of a man who'd already accepted the mathematics of disaster. 12 airlines had formally filed claims totaling $890 million in combined damages. Grounding costs, schedule disruptions, passenger rebooking, reputational harm. 2 carriers had retained litigation counsel in the Southern District of New York. 3 more were exploring regulatory complaints with the FAA and the European Union Aviation Safety Agency. Crestline's stock had dropped 41% in 8 trading days. Institutional investors were calling for an independent review. Stafford paused, looked at the board. The root cause of this exposure is the unauthorized termination of Garrett Hale, executed without board approval, without legal review, and without examination of the operative employment agreement, specifically Section 19A, which governs the company's license to operate the flight control software installed in every aircraft we've ever produced. One of the board members, Margaret said it was Carl Whitmore, the longest-serving independent director, asked the question everyone was thinking. Who authorized the termination? Stafford didn't answer. He looked at Robert. Robert Ainsworth stood up slowly. He was 64 years old. He'd built this company from a hangar and a handshake. He'd recruited me when nobody else would take the risk. And then he'd let his son-in-law drive the plane into the ground, because family felt easier than judgment. He turned to Dylan. You're done. Get out of my building. Dylan opened his mouth, started to stand. Robert, You didn't read the contract. Robert's voice was low, not a shout. The room didn't need a shout. You didn't consult legal. You didn't consult me. You fired the man who owns the software that flies our planes, and you did it because you wanted his office. He paused. The silence had weight, Get out. Dylan Marsh walked out of that boardroom with nothing. No title, no authority, no corner office with new carpet. The Tesla was still in the parking lot, the one Robert co-signed, the one with the personalized plate that read MRSH1. Margaret said he sat in it for 20 minutes before pulling out. She watched from the second-floor window. She didn't feel sorry for him. Neither did I. 3 weeks after my termination, Neil Fletcher's law office on Douglas Avenue in downtown Wichita. Oak desk, law books on built-in shelves, a framed naval aviation print on the wall. An FA-18 Hornet launching from a carrier deck, the steam still visible off the catapult. Neil had bought it at an auction in San Diego the year after we both got out. Said it reminded him that some things are built to fly, and some things are built to hold them up. I sat across from Neil and a 3-person legal team representing Meridian Avionics, Crestline's largest competitor. They'd been calling Neil's office since the FAA directive made the news. They didn't waste time with buzzwords or frameworks. They sent a term sheet within 72 hours. Their general counsel flew in from Dallas on a Tuesday. The deal was clean. I would license my proprietary autopilot and fly-by-wire control software exclusively to Meridian Avionics. $134 million up front. 8% royalties on all future maintenance, licensing, and distribution revenue generated by the software. Meridian would begin retrofitting their existing fleet and incorporating the architecture into all new production aircraft. The final page sat in front of me on Neil's desk. I read it the way I read everything, line by line, word by word, the same way I read maintenance logs aboard the Carl Vinson, the same way I read Robert Ainsworth's employment contract 15 years ago at my kitchen table. Every number checked, every clause intentional. I signed it, set the pen down on the oak surface. It made a small sound in the quiet room. The non-compete says I can't work for them, I said to Neil. Good thing I'm not working for anyone. I'm renting them my house. Neil leaned back in his chair. The naval aviation print was over his left shoulder. The most expensive house in Kansas. My phone buzzed on the table. I looked at the screen. Robert Ainsworth. 3rd attempt in 2 weeks. I looked at the caller ID for a moment. Then I picked up the pen and slid the signed agreement across the table to Meridian's counsel. The phone stopped buzzing. The aftermath wrote itself in numbers. Numbers don't embellish. They don't need to. Crestline settled the 12 airline claims 8 months later. $670 million. The company survived, but the way a building survives a fire. Still standing, hollowed out, the structural integrity permanently compromised. 2 of their 12 airline customers terminated contracts entirely and signed with Meridian. 3 more began transition planning. Dylan Marsh was named co-defendant in a $310 million shareholder derivative suit alleging breach of fiduciary duty and gross negligence. The suit specifically cited his unilateral termination of a key employee without board authorization, legal review, or examination of the operative employment agreement. His Columbia MBA now hung on the wall of a rental apartment in Overland Park. His attorney's fees were eating through whatever savings Robert's daughter had brought to the marriage. Margaret heard through the grapevine that the marriage wasn't going well either. I didn't ask for details. Within 18 months, my total personal profit exceeded $187 million. Meridian Avionics began retrofitting their fleet with my software architecture. The same code, the same autopilot logic, the same fly-by-wire failsafes, the same decision trees I'd drawn in block letters in a leather-bound notebook 20 years ago, now flew more aircraft than Crestline had ever produced. My methodology, born on a surplus server rack in a basement in Wichita, was now the standard. Robert Ainsworth never called again after the 3rd attempt. Margaret told me he resigned as CEO 6 months after the settlement. She said he looked 10 years older the day he cleaned out his office. He'd built something real. Then he'd handed the controls to someone who couldn't read the instruments. I understood that kind of loss. I just didn't carry it for him. Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the termination, 5:15 a.m. I drove Claire to swim practice in the F-150. Dark blue, 165,000 miles on the odometer. Toolbox still bolted to the bed from a job I did on the house 6 years ago. The Kansas sky was pale pink along the flat horizon, frost on the grass, the first light of dawn filling the truck cab through the windshield. The heater was on. The fan belt clicked the way it does when it's cold. A steady, rhythmic tick I keep meaning to fix and never do. Claire was in the passenger seat, goggles around her neck, hair still damp from the shower, swim bag between her feet. She smelled like shampoo and chlorine, always chlorine, soaked into everything she owns. Her towels, the car seats, the jacket she throws over the kitchen chair. She was quiet for the first few minutes, watching the empty streets roll by, the streetlights still on, the grain elevators on the edge of town standing like sentinels against the brightening sky. Then she turned to me. "Dad, you've been at every practice this month." I kept my eyes on the road. "Yeah." She looked at me, 16 years old, the kind of direct, unhurried gaze she gets from her mother. "What changed?" I adjusted the rearview mirror, didn't answer right away. A tanker from McConnell climbed into the dawn sky to the south, its navigation lights blinking against the pink. The rumble reached us 2 seconds later, rattling the truck's side mirrors the way it rattles every window within 5 miles. Normal sound, the sound of Wichita. I stopped building something for someone who didn't read the blueprints. She nodded, slow, like she understood, even though she didn't. Not fully. Not yet. She turned back to the window. The pool was 2 blocks ahead, the parking lot lights cutting bright squares into the pre-dawn dark. I pulled up to the entrance. She grabbed her bag, opened the door, and paused. "Same time tomorrow?" "Same time tomorrow." She closed the door, walked inside. I watched her disappear through the glass doors, goggles swinging from her hand, her stride long and unhurried, the walk of someone who knows exactly where she's going. I sat in the truck for a minute, engine running, thermos in the cup holder, the dented lid catching the first real light of the day. The heater clicked. The sky kept brightening, the pink deepening to gold along the flat Kansas horizon, the kind of sky that stretches so wide it makes you feel both small and steady at the same time. I wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't in a hurry. Funny thing about autopilot, it doesn't care who sits in the captain's chair. It only answers to the man who wrote it. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and ring that notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.